Each day, people expose themselves to loads of danger, sex trafficking, sexually transmitted disease, all just for some profit. And that's due to prostitution. And to even think to make prostitution legal is kind of crazy, honestly. And with the legalization of prostitution, that only increases in violence and harm to our society. So that kind of brings me to why I'm making this speech, is to kind of go over the three reasons and themes why prostitution should not be made legal. First, with the legalization of prostitution, it leads to an increase in sex trafficking, and then it leads to an increase in sexually transmitted disease. And with the legalization of prostitution, it does not stop violence for sex workers, but only greatly increases those risks of violence. So that takes me to my first point. With the legalization of prostitution leads to an increase in sex trafficking. In the article that I quoted from, I marked it down in the outline, and basically they went over a survey of 150 countries where prostitution is actually legal, and in those countries, sex trafficking and human trafficking is a huge issue they face, and the number of cases of sex trafficking has incredibly increased more and more. And that just shows that with the legalization of prostitution, it leads to an increase in sex trafficking. And people argue that sex trafficking and human trafficking was already a thing even before prostitution was made legal. Yeah, that may be true, but the numbers show that when it's made legal, that it just greatly increases the risk of there being sex trafficking. And that takes me to my next point. With the legalization of prostitution, it leads to more sexually transmitted diseases. And again, from the article that I quoted, a different one, where sexually transmitted diseases spread through prostitution. It's in the outline along with the other one. And it just talks about how when prostitution is made legal, the more cases of STDs increases greatly, and those numbers just skyrocket. And people like to argue that even when prostitution is made legal, they have better access to healthcare and things to stop those STDs. But that's not true at all. See, when sex is made legal, it makes more sex. There's easier ways to get sex, and with more sex in sexual situations, it leads to an increase in sexually transmitted disease. That's just how it works. And the article also went over how when sex work is made legal, some business managers or people that buy those sex workers would want to use unprotected sex, unsafe sex for more and better profit. And that just leads to more sexually transmitted diseases. And lastly, that takes me to my last point, where the legalization of prostitution does not stop violence for sex workers, but actually greatly increases it. And that's shown through both my points that I've said in this one article, where it quotes that sex workers, even when prostitution is made legal, are still exposed to violence. There's interviews of sex workers going over saying how they're left in the room still unprotected, no supervision, and they're still harmed. They're still exposed to violence. And when it's legal, they're still exposed to sex trafficking and human trafficking. And when it's made legal, they're still exposed to STDs, sexually transmitted diseases. None of making prostitution legal doesn't stop that at all. It only greatly increases those risks of violence, sex trafficking, and STDs. And just wrap everything up to go over again what I just said. First, prostitution leads to more sex trafficking. Prostitution leads to more STDs and sexually transmitted diseases. And prostitution leads to more violence and more harm for these sex workers. Making prostitution legal doesn't benefit anybody except for the wicked, the sex traffickers, and it's just only harms those people around him and our society. So that is why prostitution should not be made legal. And thank you for listening. My name is Colin Anderson.